I'm Jethro Mullen, head of the IEA's communications team. I'm joined today by IEA Executive Director, Dr. Fatih Birol, by Chief Energy Economist, Tim Gould, and by the head of our Energy Investment Unit, Cecilia Tam, who is the lead author of the new report, which is free to read and download on our website. So during today's press webinar, Dr. Birol will make some opening remarks, and then Tim and Cecilia will present the key findings of the report. We'll then take questions from journalists. For the journalists taking part in this press webinar, we invite you to send your questions via the Q&A function in the Zoom. You can do this at any point during the presentation, and we'll also take a 2-minute break right after the presentation for you to enter your questions. With that, I'll hand over to our Executive Director, Dr. Birol.
Many thanks, Jethro. Greetings to everybody from International Energy Agency headquarters in Paris. Dear colleagues, many of you must realize that we are publishing a lot of reports on different parts of the energy sector, issues related to climate change, issues related to energy access in developing countries. But this report, in a sense, is unique. I think it is the only report in the world which looks at the entire budget of global energy sector. There are reports, studies looking at the oil and gas investments, some of them for solar, some of them for the pipelines, other one refineries, other one for grids. But this is the single, in my view, comprehensive report which looks at the entire global energy sector. What is our budget in the energy world? Why it is important to have this number, or to have these numbers, I should say, is because we want to understand in what does it mean, those investments for energy security, for climate change, for affordability, and other related issues. In fact, it was this report was one of the first initiatives we had when we opened the new chapter for the IEA some 8-9 years ago. And at that time, when we published the first report, I remember the amount of investments going to oil, gas, and coal, fossil fuels, were higher, slightly higher than the clean energy. So it was 8-9 years ago. After a while, we saw a few years the investments going to clean energy and fossil fuels were more or less equal. But in the last few years, we have seen investments going to clean energy. They are much stronger. But let me first start to give you the overall number. Our report finds out that this year, 2024, global energy investments, fossil fuels, clean energy, everything put together, for the first time, exceeds $3 trillion. $3 trillion. And the ratio I mentioned to you, the fossil fuels versus the clean energy, this year takes an important shape. Namely, out of this $3 trillion of the entire energy sector investments, $1 trillion goes to fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas, and about $2 trillion go to clean energy. This is something important, 1-to-2 ratio, which changed a lot in the last few years. Now, this is, I think, something very important to see the direction of travel as far as energy investments are concerned. But there is also one number in the report that I had the opportunity to read recently, that my colleagues Tim Gould, Cecilia Tam, and the entire IEA team worked out, that the amount of investments this year going to renewable electricity and grids put together, renewable electricity and grids put together, are higher than all fossil fuel investments, coal, oil, and gas. So this again shows the strong momentum renewables, electricity, and the others have in terms of attracting investments. So this, of course, attracting investment is good, but one of the, I think, the beauties of this report is it shows which country, how much investment for which part of the energy sector. And when I look at the attracting clean energy investments, I see, in my view, rather a worrying trend. Namely, of this $2 trillion of clean energy investment, global clean energy investment, $2 trillion, 85% of it goes to a handful of countries, namely advanced economies plus China. And the rest, the 15% of the clean energy investments, are taking place in emerging and developing countries where more than 2/3 of the population lives. So I think this is, in my view, this is the biggest fault line of reaching a clean and secure energy world. And this is an area I think international community needs to pay attention to. Dear colleagues, there are two specific energy technologies that I want to highlight some facts. One of them is solar, the other one is nuclear power. Solar, when we look at the solar investments, and of course deployment as well, we see that the solar is transforming the electricity sector around the world, south, north, and everywhere. And this year, we expect the investments going to solar generation exceeds $500 billion US dollars. And this is the first time in the history. And the amount of investments going to solar electricity generation is higher than all other electricity generation options. Namely, solar investments are higher than coal plus gas plus wind plus hydro plus everything put together. Solar is much bigger. So as I said, it is transforming the electricity sector, and more to come here. The other option, the other fuel I want to mention to you is nuclear power. We see after so many years a renewed momentum in nuclear investments, as IEA has rightly anticipated a few years ago. This year, we expect nuclear investments to grow about 20%, 20%, both in terms of the investments in lifetime extension of the existing nuclear power plants, but also for new builds in Europe, US, China, Korea, and elsewhere. The driver, a key driver of the strong growth in the clean energy investments is, in my view, is the industrial policy. Many countries, many governments, I wouldn't say all, but many governments around the world saw or read the game that the next chapter of the manufacturing, the industry sector, lies in clean energy manufacturing. And this gives a boost to government policies in terms of subsidies, incentives, regulations, and others. And here we see China is leading the game. The report coming from my colleagues, I would really suggest anybody who wants to understand the investment and the finance of energy sector to have a look at it. That report shows that China alone accounts about 1/3 of global clean energy investments, about $675 billion US. By far the biggest contributor, followed by Europe and United States. And when I look at China, I see that there are 3 new industries that are leading the investment momentum there. The first one is solar. The second one is the lithium batteries, and the third one is electric vehicle manufacturing. So these are the 3 drivers in terms of China's push. Dear colleagues, we also see that the investment in fossil fuel supply is growing. Our numbers show that this year we expect about a 7% growth in the oil and gas investments, mainly coming from the national oil companies in Middle East and in Asia. And this is, as my colleague Mr. Gould will tell you, this trend is very much in line with the oil and gas demand trends we see in the next years to come with the current policy setting. Having said that, I also wanted to raise the issue that when we look at the current oil and gas markets, namely in terms of oil markets, about 6 million barrels per day of spare production capacity, and more to come. Second, slowing down of the oil demand growth, as we have said several times in our oil market report and other publications. And third, looking at the huge amount of LNG coming to market, as we have already highlighted in our recent World Energy Outlook, so that the markets are turning to slowly but surely to buyer's market. Looking at this, at least these 3 elements, I think the investors in oil and gas sector may need to think twice, even with the current policy setting, leave aside a world which takes steps to cope with our climate challenge. Talking about the oil and gas industry, maybe another interesting number we have in our report, namely recently we heard a lot that, and I was very happy to hear that at different occasions, including the last one being the COP28, the successful COP28 in Dubai, that the oil and gas industry, they are keen to be a part of the solution when we address our climate change challenge. I was very happy to hear that, and I did ask my colleagues, can we please, dear Tim, dear Cecilia and colleagues, look at why we have this strong and good responsible claims from oil and gas industry that they want to be part of the solution, which we do welcome, but how these claims, statements compare with the investment composition of investment, how much money goes to clean energy, and how much investments, the capital goes to their traditional operations. Unfortunately, the result of their analysis show that today only 4% of the capital spending goes to clean energy, and 96% goes to their traditional operations. So, dear colleagues, this is a very interesting report. Looks at the budget of our energy world. What does it mean for energy security? What does it mean for affordability? What does it mean for climate change and other challenges also for the industrial policy? And there are a lot of numbers and there are a lot of messages. But if I have to pick up one important implications of this report is not enough investment is going in the emerging and developing countries. As I said, only 15% of the clean energy investment going to countries where we have more than 2/3 of the population live and where the bulk of the energy demand growth set to come. So this is a key issue, and I hope this report will give another heads up to the decision makers at the national level and at international level. So with this, I would like to turn to my colleague, our Chief Energy Economist, Tim Good, with my, once again, many thanks for the great work, and looking forward to listening to you, Tim. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Executive Director, and grateful to all of those who've joined us today. This is now the 9th edition of our World Energy Investment, and over that period since 2016 when we first published it, it's really become a reference for data and analysis of those capital flows coming in to the energy sector. And I'd like to talk through a little bit more the findings that we have in this year's edition. The Executive Director mentioned that figure of 3 trillion that we've reached for the first time in terms of total capital flows to the energy sector. We anticipate that that's going to be reached in 2024. That's quite a big change from where we were only a few years ago. You can see that period in the late 2010s when the situation was much more static. You had similar amounts of money going each year into fossil fuels and clean energy. You can also see for the fossil fuel side the disruptive impact of the pandemic in particular in 2020. But there's also been a dramatic shift in terms of the amount of capital going to clean energy. And just to be clear, when we talk about clean energy, we're talking about a wide range of technologies. So across renewable power, low emissions fuels, grids and storage, also on the demand side, money spent on electrification and on energy efficiency improvements. But what's really striking this time around is if we isolate just 2 of those elements, we just talk about renewable power and grids, we find that the amount of capital going into just those 2 areas is now greater than the amount being spent on all aspects of fossil fuel supply, oil, natural gas, and coal. And for us, that's a very striking symbol of the shift towards a more electrified, renewable-rich energy system. So the main element of our World Energy Investment is to track capital flows, but it's also very important to track the underlying economics of different projects, and that means looking closely at technology costs, but also at financing costs. So we maintain various indices which allow us to think through what's happening to those technology costs. On the left, you have a visible indication of that extended run of cost declines that we've seen for clean technologies. On the right, a more stable picture for oil and gas upstream costs, but visible that costs also came down in the middle of the last decade as the industry reacted to the oil price fall of 2014, 2015. But if we extend the picture up to the present day, you can also see the effects of a very turbulent last few years, which produced significant upward pressure on costs across the board. That's to do with supply chain pressures during the pandemic or in the aftermath of the pandemic, and that was followed by much higher mineral, energy, material prices in 2022 and into 2023. Now, those cost pressures are now easing. We're seeing a resumption, particularly for clean energy, in the downward cost trend for those technologies in particular. But there's a new headwind that we have to have in mind. The era of cheap money, of cheap borrowing, is now over. Interest rates are higher, and the cost of financing energy projects is considerably higher than it was. Now, not all energy projects are affected in the same way by this new macroeconomic environment. It does complicate the life for developers of capital-intensive clean energy projects. It hurts the economics of both some mature renewables as well as emerging technologies like hydrogen. It's less of an issue for upstream oil and gas operators whose balance sheets are in reasonable shape after a period of record revenues and profits, although it could create difficulties for some projects in the midstream, particularly for LNG projects that need project finance. But despite this headwind, we have this figure of $3 trillion in capital investment. So where's that money going? The executive director talked already about that 2-to-1, or that almost 2-to-1 split between money going to clean energy and to fossil fuels. And here's, within that world of fossil fuels, this is where the money is going for oil, natural gas and coal. When you think about that oil and natural gas number, 2/3 of that is in the upstream. The remainder is in refineries, gas processing and transportation, including the start of what we see as quite an important new wave of investment in LNG export facilities. And when we break that down by region, the breakdown here isn't necessarily correlated with production. The Middle East, for example, is a giant of oil and gas production, but it comes at relatively low cost, so the share of investment there is smaller. And we switch across to the clean energy side. The main element there is renewable power, very dynamic, on its own expected to account for some $750 billion of investment in 2024. But this does need to be accompanied by grids and storage. That's been an incredibly important part of our own communication on clean energy transitions in recent months and years. It's been lagging behind, particularly on the grid side, but we are seeing finally signs of that picking up, and it exceeds for the first time $400 billion in investment this year. We are seeing rising on the energy efficiency and end use side. The electrification part of that is quite dynamic, largely because of the increased spending on electric mobility. But where we are more worried is on efficiency, which is not moving anything like as quickly. And which countries and regions are taking the lead? This, for me, is a remarkable picture. China, such a strong powerhouse for clean energy investment, 1/3 of the global total, as the executive director mentioned. And it's broadly comparable to the amount that the European Union and the United States together put into clean energy. So there's plenty to unpack here, and with Cecilia, we're going to dive in quickly on 3 topics. I'll talk a little bit more about oil and gas and the regional disparities in clean energy spending, and then I'll pass it across to Cecilia to talk a little bit about solar and some other topics that we've looked at in detail in this year's work. Firstly, that oil and gas picture. And what we find in 2024 is that oil and gas investment in aggregate is now back to where it was prior to the pandemic. But we haven't returned to the same place, and there's been some interesting shifts in the meantime in upstream spending in particular. There's been a move, a slight but perceptible move across towards investment in gas as companies respond to high prices and the gap in the market created by Russia's cut to pipeline supplies to Europe. Among the national oil companies, the NOCs that you can see on the screen, we are seeing higher investment than before by large players in the Middle East and also to some extent in Asia. Other NOC spending is down, and that's largely because of the difficulties that the Russian NOCs are facing. And investment by the majors has also not returned to where it was in 2019. And last but not least, a very important point that the Executive Director mentioned about investment by the oil and gas industry in clean energy. We looked at this in detail in analysis last year in the run-up to COP28 in Dubai. And that picture varies quite substantially by different type of company. But when you look in aggregate, that figure remains low, around 4% of total capital expenditure. And the second element I wanted to highlight, and this is a point that the Executive Director emphasized, and I don't think we can say it often enough, is this disparity in clean energy investment flows across regions. There's that encouraging picture that we've seen in recent years of that pickup to $2 trillion worth of clean energy investment. But when you start to break it down, you can see that a substantial amount was accounted by advanced economies. And then within emerging and developing economies, if you take out China as well, you know, a different and more worrying picture emerges. That you can see a slight upward trend, largely thanks to a few large players like India and Brazil. But let's have in mind what the Executive Director said. This segment includes countries that are home to 2/3 of the world's population and that are likely to see very dynamic energy demand growth in future years. And so it is a worrying indicator indeed that only 15% of clean energy investment is going to these economies. And that's a clear warning sign for our transitions, as was mentioned. To say more on this and other topics, I now turn to Cecilia.
Thanks very much, Tim. As the Executive Director mentioned, solar is this year's bright spot. We anticipate that investments in solar this year will exceed $500 billion for the very first time. This represents a quadrupling in solar energy investments in just a decade. Last year, solar already outstripped investments in other generation technologies as cost declines helped to spur continued growth in new solar investments around the world. This positive trend that we've seen with solar has also been extended to wind and nuclear that have also picked up in recent years. Investments this year in wind are expected to hit $200 billion for the first time, and nuclear investments are expected to reach about $80 billion as countries invest in lifetime extensions in Europe and the US, and new additions in China and India drive investments higher. In contrast, you can see here that coal and gas-fired generation investments continue to decline over the last decade. New coal investments are now just a quarter of where they were 10 years ago, and investments in gas are just over half. Today, for every dollar invested in unabated fossil fuel power, $10 are invested in clean power. This ratio was just 1 in 2 only 10 years ago. This rapid transition of the power sector shows how, with the right policies and enhanced international support, we can achieve power sector decarbonization. This year's World Energy Investment report includes a detailed review and mapping of the key actors that are making energy investment decisions and also those who are providing the capital to finance these projects. On the investment side, decisions by governments, corporates, and households will determine the pace of the energy transition. As the role of these three actors play in energy investment decisions vary across regions, we see that corporations really play the central role in investment decisions in advanced economies. And decisions made by households are playing an increasingly important role in the pace of clean energy transitions through their investment decisions on the purchase of vehicles, homes, and equipment. In China, we see that governments and state-owned enterprises are really the determining factor, and to a lesser degree, decision made by households. In other emerging and developing economies, both governments, through state-owned enterprises, as well as corporates, mainly through small and medium enterprises, are really setting the pace of the energy transition. In terms of financing, you can see here that the vast majority of capital is coming from commercial sources. In China, we see that public investments are also particularly important and have really helped to keep the cost of capital low in China. While in other emerging and developing economies, the development finance institutions play a critical role in helping to mobilize much larger portions of commercial capital, as well as providing capital for riskier emerging technologies and to investments in riskier countries that would otherwise struggle to access affordable capital. Now, at COP28 in Dubai, countries agreed to ambitious energy and climate goals, including tripling renewable energy capacity and doubling the rate of energy efficiency improvements in 2030. Now, what does this mean for investments? As we saw earlier, the current momentum behind renewables and clean power is impressive. If we assume that this current spending continues to increase, we could reach about 2/3 of the total investments needed to triple renewable capacity by 2030. Now, meeting that tripling goal will require a doubling in the level of investments in renewables, grids, and batteries by 2030. While we're making good progress globally on renewables, reaching the goal will require a rapid scale-up in all regions, particularly in other emerging and developing economies where the high cost of capital has made investments more challenging and expensive to finance. The goal of doubling the pace of energy efficiency improvements requires an even greater effort. While we have seen impressive growth in electrification of transport, particularly in China and in advanced economies, investments in efficiency and end-use measures, notably for buildings retrofits, is well below where they need to be. Our tracking of investments in buildings has shown a decrease in 2023, and we're expected to see a further decline this year. Reaching the doubling goal will require a tripling in the current rate of spending on efficiency and electrification, reaching about 1.9 trillion in 2030. While this year's report highlights many encouraging trends, overall, today's clean energy investments are not at the level necessary for the world to limit global warming to just 1.5 degrees, nor to achieve the interim goals agreed at COP28. While all countries and regions will need to increase clean energy investments, the increase is steepest in other emerging and developing economies. The high cost of capital remains one of the largest barriers to investments in clean energy projects in this part of the world. So to meet energy and climate goals will require enhanced international support. This includes scaling up concessional funding from development finance institutions for clean energy investments in emerging and developing economies. These funds also need to work much harder to leverage higher volumes of private capital, particularly for investments in enabling infrastructure such as grids and energy storage, for emerging technologies, and towards the least developed countries that will otherwise struggle to access adequate and affordable capital. Since 2015, DFIs outside of China have dispersed nearly 20 billion on average per year towards funding clean energy investments in emerging and developing economies. Support for grids and transport have received the lion's share of funding, followed by support for solar, wind, and hydro. Support for building retrofits and high energy performance buildings and equipment remains far too low, with too little invested in this sector. In summary, while we see a number of bright spots in the energy investment landscape, led by record investments in solar, grids, and EVs, major imbalances remain, as have been highlighted by the Executive Director and by Tim. While the world needs to double clean energy investments by 2030, the tasks at hand in other emerging and developing economies is much larger, requiring a quadrupling of investments. While we believe this is still within reach, it will require a concerted effort from the international community to scale up investments in clean energy. Thank you, and now back to you, Jethro.
Thanks a lot, Cecilia and Tim, for the presentation. We now have time to take some questions from journalists. So we invite the journalists in attendance to send your questions through the Q&A function of the Zoom, if you haven't done so already. And please mention your media outlet along with your question. We'll take a 2-minute break to give you a chance to enter your questions, and we'll be right back. Welcome back. Thank you very much to the journalists for the questions so far. We'll get through as many as we can in the time we have left. So to start off with a question on oil and gas. You showed us how much money is going into oil and gas. How does this compare with the IEA's different scenarios, including for net zero emissions by 2050? And there's one other question just come in on this topic from Rafiq Latta from Energy Intelligence. You mentioned oil and gas investment is on the rise. FIDs in coal spiked. Have you modelled what this means for the transition if this trend persists? So maybe those are two questions. I'll squeeze in one more. Why are investments in clean energy in developing countries not taking off despite the falling technology costs that you're talking about? So perhaps the questions on oil and gas I can pass to Tim, and then Cecilia on the emerging and developing economies.
So thanks very much for that question on oil and gas. And indeed, what we do in this report, we track the amount of capital going into different parts of the energy sector. But it's also important to consider what that means. What are the implications of today's capital flows for energy security, for sustainability, for affordability? And so what we do is we benchmark those flows against the insights that we get from our IEA scenarios. And when we look at the amount of money going into oil and gas supply, so that's just under 900 billion in 2024 in our view, and just shy of 600 is going into the upstream. Those numbers are broadly comparable to the amounts that would be required in our stated policy scenario. So that's a scenario that sort of gives us the current direction of travel based on today's policy settings. There's a few open questions, as the executive director highlighted. Global spare oil production capacity is already around 6 million barrels a day, and that's relatively high by historical standards. He's also highlighted that influx of LNG that we're expecting from newly approved projects in the years to come. So those are certainly things to watch when it comes to that. When it comes to that kind of world. But of course, there's another possibility that we could see an acceleration in energy transitions. And as many of you will be aware, we have other scenarios that look at what the trajectory for meeting national and global climate goals would mean for oil and gas demand and for investment. So in a world in which countries hit their targets in full and on time, including net zero goals where governments have them, the amount being spent today is around 1/3 higher than would be needed to meet lower oil and gas demand in 2030. And if we were to get on track fully for a 1.5 degree scenario, you would see further reductions in oil and gas demand, and that would mean that today's spending on oil and gas would be more than twice the amount that would be required in such a scenario. So I think in answer to Rafiq Latta's question, yes, we do consider what this means for the global energy system. He also mentioned coal. I think coal is an interesting one because when you look at final investment decisions, there were a significant number of new coal plants approved in last year. Nearly 50 gigawatts, almost all of that was in China. And we've written about this in the report and put that also in the context of some difficult electricity security episodes that China has faced, particularly where you've had heat waves, you've had low hydro output in some cases. And in our view, these approvals are motivated strongly by energy security considerations. But given the amount of capital that is also flowing into new renewable projects in China and also into nuclear, we have open questions about how much some of that coal capacity will be utilized. Because even with strong electricity demand growth, we don't see that there is a need for those plants to run at very high utilization rates.
Thank you, Tim. And then maybe Cecilia on the emerging and developing economies question.
Thanks very much. So despite the tracking of capital equipment costs, which have seen tremendous declines over the last years, we're still not seeing enough invested in emerging and developing economies. And the main reason for this is really because of the very high cost of capital that we see in this region. We have been tracking through our cost of capital observatory the cost of financing across different emerging and developing economies. And what we see is that compared to advanced economies, the cost of finance can be 2 to 3 times higher than in advanced economies. Now, while in advanced economies, we see that the largest component of, for example, the levelized cost of electricity is the cost of the equipment cost or capital costs. What we see in emerging and developing economies is that the highest component to the levelized cost of electricity is actually financing costs, where they can represent up to 60% of overall electricity costs for solar PV. Now, why are these costs so much higher? And this is really linked to both real and perceived risks of investments in these countries. in many of the emerging and developing economies, we're not necessarily seeing the right types of policy frameworks. There isn't enough clarity on investments, and the overall macroeconomic risks in countries have also made the cost of finance particularly high in this part of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia. And we have a couple more questions on financing, and we'll try and cover them all. One other question is about what is driving the increase in clean energy investment. So is this increase driven by concerns about climate change? And then coming back to the financing topic, Dr. Birol, you were recently in Azerbaijan, where you met with the president of Azerbaijan, the president of COP29, and other government leaders to discuss the preparations for COP29. And as we know, finance is a key issue for this COP. So how do you think the findings of this new IEA report can help the discussions for COP29 on finance? And then following on from that, given the disparity in investment, in energy investment between developed and emerging economies, and sorry, this question is from Florence Jones from the from Sustainable Views at the Financial Times. Given this disparity, what should be the role of wealthier nations in supporting the transition of emerging economies? So I think those last few questions, perhaps Dr. Birol can take those.
Thanks, Jethro. Maybe first I start with what drives the clean energy investment, such as strong momentum. As our chief energy economist said, a strong momentum, not sufficient enough to be in line with our climate targets. But what is the driver of this strong momentum for clean energy investment? I think many people believe that the climate change concerns are the key driver. It is definitely a key driver, but I am not sure that it is the key driver of clean energy investments and the strong momentum we have seen in the last few years. I think there are at least two other key drivers. One of them is the energy security. In Europe, for example, many countries are giving a fresh look at nuclear power, and beyond Europe as well. And we have seen that in Europe in the last 2 years, the deployment of renewables and grids, they have accelerated. They are mainly driven by energy security concerns. I think there is a growing comprehension that the clean energy means secure energy. And more fossil fuels doesn't necessarily mean more energy security. I think there is a growing comprehension there, and there's a much more balanced energy policy making as far as these issues are concerned. So energy security is one driver in addition to climate change. But in my view, the main driver of this strong growth in clean energy investment here is industrial policy. Several countries, governments understood that tomorrow's industry sector is going to focus on clean energy manufacturing. Solar panels, batteries, electric cars, heat pumps, electrolyzers, wind turbines. And therefore, there is a competition among the governments, among the countries around the world to have a strong position in the next chapter of the industry sector. And I wouldn't be surprised that these industrial policies of pushing the clean energy investments and the trade policies are more and more interwoven in the next years to come. So climate change is a driver, but in my view, not the main driver nowadays. industrial policy is the key driver. The reduction of the cost of clean energies, they are becoming more competitive, is a driver. Energy security is a driver, and they will all help to increase the clean energy investments. The second point, the financing the clean energy investment in emerging and developing countries from Financial Times, and the other question about my recent visit to Baku. So, dear colleagues, we on our way to address climate change, there are many challenges. But if I have to pick one of them, it is how we are going to make sure that the capital, the international capital, domestic capital, whatever it is, meets with the clean energy projects in emerging and developing countries. The report, our report, says only 15% of the all energy investment are taking place in the emerging and developing countries, where more than 2/3 of the population lives. And when we look at the numbers, we see really very disappointing data. I give you one of them. My colleague Cecilia highlighted the growing role of solar energy in the electricity sector around the world, by far the number one. Having said that, today in entire sub-Saharan Africa, where we have more than half of the global solar radiation, we have received the lots of solar radiation, every second person doesn't have access to electricity in sub-Saharan Africa, yet currently amount of solar electricity we generate in sub-Saharan Africa is less than solar electricity we produce in Netherlands. Just look at the map of the world and look at the sizes, look at the radiation, solar radiation. I think this is something that is really disturbing. So what needs to happen? Again, I raised this issue with the President Aliyev of Azerbaijan last Monday, and the president of COP29. I believe COP29 should be, together with following with the COP30 in Brazil, should focus on the very issue how we can bring the countries together, both the advanced economies, international financial institutions, in order to support the clean energy financing in emerging developing countries through different means, from de-risking the investments through different measures, or increasing the concession funding, especially from international financial institutions which were founded on the premise of supporting the economic growth in developing countries. So this would be my answer to the question from FT and the others.
Thank you, Dr. Birol. That is all we have time for. If any journalists have questions that didn't get answered during the Q&A that you'd like to follow up on, we invite you to reach out to our press office and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. So it just remains to say thank you again to Dr. Birol, to Tim, to Cecilia. Thank you very much to the journalists for your questions, and to everyone following this event online for your interest in our work. The full report, the World Energy Investment 2024, is available for free on our website, so do please take a look. And that's all for today. Thank you and goodbye.